Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of the symposium, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. We had a very encouraging and very positive start yesterday with a lot of good speakers sharing their thoughts and views on this platform. We had a good response from the audience as well as the media. And today, I really look forward because we've got a completely fresh slant on the same topic. And I must say that I would like to thank each and every one of you, starting with the speakers, to say that it's not easy to travel up and down into new offers and new opportunities that come your way. So when you accept them positively, we consider it as a sign of respect and support for our institution, and it's highly valued, and thank you for taking out the time to come here. I'd like to thank my patrons, the Emami Group, who have not only made this building possible, but continue to support every activity that my co-director Richa and I enthusiastically plan to conduct in this space. So please enjoy the rest of the day, and I'd like to invite Shwetal to start with the program. Thank you.
Good morning. I'd like to invite Dr. Sook Kyung-Lee and Sheela Gowda to the stage for the first session today. The conversation between Dr. Lee, who's the Senior Curator of International Art at Tate Modern, and artist Sheela Gowda, is titled The Transformation of Every Day in South Asian Art. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the organizers to invite me here. It's a great opportunity to really look at new art center here, but also meeting artists and all the people working in art in one place. And thank you for making time to come for this symposium on a Sunday. So I think what I would like to really discuss with artist Sheela Gowda today is how she might approach to the making of art, and how this changing, perhaps very rapidly changing artistic but also cultural and social political environment, and what kind of responses she is trying to perhaps make as an artist living in this time. And the sort of locality of her materials, but also the way she creates this very process-based artworks has been really interesting to me personally, but also to the institution I work for. And we now have a very large installation by Sheela Gowda in our gallery, Behold, which she will hopefully say a little bit about. In the gallery, and very informally how she might do these things and see whether that resonates with a larger sort of artistic community here and in South Asia, but also internationally. So Sheela, I will just take your lead, and then we can perhaps talk about your work.
Good morning, everybody. I thought I was going to be asked questions, so I would be responding to it. But, well, there's a very large kind of background given to my work. And it's really hard to talk about my work without the particularity of a particular object or a material that I'm using. It's very hard to talk in general about it. So maybe I should begin to show some of the images, and then probably the talk will lead to something larger. Perhaps one of the terms that are constantly used in reference to the making of my work is that of labor. One is labor, the other is material. The third sometimes is craft. Now, I have my views on what craft is, and in addition to that, what craft tradition is. And it's a very, very difficult term to define in the Indian context, also perhaps in the Asian context, because it is so intertwined with what we call folk, what we call design, what we call as tradition. So I would use the word very carefully. But in relation to my own work, I'm looking at things that I encounter. Now, we encounter a lot of things in daily life. Not all of them speak to us, and not all of them do we pay the same attention to. Now, why do I pick up something that everybody sees on a daily basis? Why do I put it out there as part of my work? I guess it has a lot to do with the kind of thinking that one does outside of the work. The information we are getting fed with, the nature of politics in this country now and the past, and perhaps the future, the direction it's going in, the economies, our own position, especially where we come from, what is our relationship to people outside of our own kind of milieu. I think these are all things that are constantly going on in one's head. So I think all this feeds into the interest you show in a certain material out there, because you feel that can, in a way, address a lot of these things that are going on. So in that sense, it's not about them alone. They become the tools, but they're also about themselves. So, and that is how I've always responded to things, and that's how works happen.
And especially when you're sort of selecting materials, and is the everyday sort of quality the most important thing, or is it more specific to that time or the sort of changing time, perhaps more pre-industrial or post-industrial, that type of things?
I think the everyday part just happens because you see it all the time. For example, and a lot of the stuff is seen in around, I mean, everybody of you all would have seen it, but then when I pick it up and I present it and they say, was it really there? I had not seen it before, you know. So one of them, for example, the very obvious one would be the grinding stones that I placed in Kochi Biennale, in the first Kochi Biennale. And the first initial ones, about 65 of them, were photographed in an area of just 2 kilometers range. And when I told people these, I picked it up from the street, I said, really? I've never seen them. So they are there, but they are invisible till you actually give it a role to play and you put it in another context. I think that context that we are putting in is a crux of it, really. And I don't mean that it was in Kochi Biennale. I mean that it was presented to a public who have come there with the open mind, ready to receive, and looking, wanting to see something. So that is the context I'm talking about. And that is I guess, the context of a museum, the context of a gallery, the context of a special occasion where these things are presented.
And when I think about the work like Behold, which includes human hair and a lot of weaving.
Can I just show some of, how does it go? How does, okay, I'll just go back. This is, okay, this one, okay.
So this is actually the installation view. So this is basically what you have created as like a web or rope. And made of human hair, largely from the sort of temples where rituals were held. Then you combine them with these very shiny metal sort of bumper sort of materials from modern cars. And this has raised a lot of questions within our own audience in London, and who may not be very familiar with sort of Indian cultures or sort of lives, what is happening in very fast developing country like India. And if you can maybe perhaps expand a bit more about the materiality of human hair and how you juxtapose it with certain different materials, they may actually explain a little further about the meaning of the work.
Okay, I mean, I don't know if it's common here in Calcutta, but certainly very common in South India, especially the state that I come from. To see this black ropes tied around the bumpers of cars. And I've always thought that it was basically, what is it called? Sheep, the wool. I didn't realize it was human hair for a long time. In fact, I picked it up as a material in 1992 itself, but I did things with it, but I really did not see a meaning to it till I came upon the realization that this is actually human hair. Then things fell into place. And then the other part is that it was also made of little tiny bits of hair, not long pieces of hair, and it was woven into a rope as a kind of not from big factories, but from little factories, cottage industries, So there was a lot of people involved in the making of it for whom it was a small economy, and so that was one realization at the level of where it comes from. The second was, okay, human hair. Why human hair? What does that have to do with the vehicle, and why do they tie it around it? Okay, black is seen as a talisman itself, black threads or on wrists or around waists of boys. So black was one part of it, but the hair part of it, my guess is that there is a sense of vulnerability for every human being who sits behind the wheel of a vehicle, and it's a strange contradiction that you are in charge of that vehicle, but you also feel terribly vulnerable. So you need some other forces to offer you that luck. And so why human hair? So my feeling is that this human hair is basically about a sacrifice that's already made, because the hair is collected from religious places where people go to offer their hair as a fulfillment of a vow taken to the gods for whatever they have been through in their life. It's already they have offered that as a sacrifice. Of course, hair is the only one that will rain you, so you won't offer your leg or your arm. So it's a little bit of a concession, a bit of a cheating, but so in a way it consists of not just human hair, it consists of females, it consists of children, it consists probably of many other religious identities as well. It's male, female, of course, the gender issue, old, young. So it's such a coming together of so many people's hair that it becomes then a collective to represent humanity as such. So I chose to select the basic element that how you see it, which is the bumper, but I use the bumper as a representative of the industrial, the shiny steel, which is held up by this hair, which is made by bits of hair coming together to make that strong rope. So this was the whole crux of the thing. So in a way, in this work, I have thought through at many levels.
And I wonder how long it took you to make such a scale of a work like this one.
Well, firstly, I did not make the hair rope myself. It is available in ritual material shops. as 3.5 meter lengths, and there's 4,000 meters here, so 4 kilometers. So my work has been the act of putting it together seamlessly to make an endless line. So that took me a month, and of course sourcing the bumpers was very tough, because these are Fiat car bumpers, and I chose them for their beautiful form. And I was looking at the ambassador cars. They're like they're dinosaurs now, you know. So here in Calcutta, you still see them. And I was looking at them. There's actually one bumper here which is belonging to an ambassador car, which is always, it's on the floor. So, but these are Fiat car bumpers. And I showed this in Venice for the first time, and it made a bit of sense to also have Fiat car bumpers in Venice, because it's Italian, it's an origin from Italy, Fiat cars.
And especially when you think about the sort of the process of making within your work, I mean, however, it may be yourself or artisans or just workers who just manually do this labor every day, I think it's important to see how this type of human labor, very intensive labor, is behind a lot of industrial materials and products. Mm-hmm. So how does that sort of relate to your artistic process?
Okay. Actually, as you mentioned, the labor has already happened in at a certain economic levels. So it's more of my recognizing that it is not a ready-made rope spun out of one machine, but the fact that it is handmade, you can see it. They're using kind of hand-operated machines, but it's still controlled completely by the thing. They have to be there, they have to guide it, they have to do things by hand with it. And my act of putting it together was mine alone. I mean, I was doing it all by myself. Nearly ruined my eyes or whatever, but I did it. And sourcing of the materials I do myself, because a lot of the time I go looking for something and I find something else, and some other idea has started off, and I wouldn't give that up by outsourcing all that work to somebody else, because I'm losing out, actually. I'm not gaining by giving work to somebody else to go get me this material, I want 5 kgs of it or whatever. I think it's a very important part of that interaction. Otherwise, I would be in my studio doing what? Like, where are the ideas coming from?
I believe you have some other images to show us.
Oh, yeah.
Perhaps that can lead us to other conversations.
Okay. Yeah. This is called Kage Bangara, meaning crow's gold. And it's one of many series of work. I wouldn't say series, because the only common factor about them is the material, the drums. Again, this is again economies of a certain kind. These are drums. These are drums that are used by road workers as temporary shelters. And you asked me the question with the previous work as to where my part of the thing comes in terms of labor. And this particular one, I receive it from, I went all over Bangalore following these road workers from whom I procured maybe 3 at a time, drums which had completely bashed up, which was put together by a person called Rehmat, who was so fantastic with his hands. Only he could retrieve these drums and make them whole again. This is not something I could have done. Definitely not. So a large part of the labor of this is really his. But I'm there working, even then, I'm working there as his assistant. He's not my assistant. I'm his assistant, where his skills are better than mine. And and of course there are details in this. There's a house there right behind, which you don't see, camouflaged at the back, which is the prototype house of the road makers. So there's a lot of associative things with it, which I do not want to go detail into, but I guess I am also referencing modernism in the form that I have displayed it. So there is a kind of a tension between the materials and the form that one sees it as. Inside one of them, inside one of the drums is this mica sheet which is which is placed at the bottom of the drum to simulate water. Yeah. So these are three about this high drums. Yeah. The tar drums, basically to make the road. Yeah. Okay. So you would like to say something?
So I think what may help translate your work to a larger audience beyond India or who are familiar with these materials is that part of the modernism or the legacies of international sort of development of artistic languages within your work. And I understand that you started as a painter in training, but then you sort of obviously decided that other forms of representation was better for what you were sort of interested as an artist. So maybe larger installations and using objects and materials from sort of beyond artistic realm. So if you can maybe say more about how these aesthetic choices sometimes sort of dictate the selection of the material perhaps, and then maybe the coming together of materials and process within your work by that standard perhaps.
I'm not really talking to an audience either only here in India or abroad. I guess I'm talking to somebody, the discerning few who understand it as language first, not as material. I mean material in their original cultural sense. As you might see, there's a certain particularity of where these things come from, but the forms are always abstract. And to me, the abstraction is what is the language that cuts across countries, nations. And the other aspect that I'm always thinking about is modernity. So modernity is a universal phenomena at different levels of development or not development. I hate the word, actually. So it's so misused. Of idea, or rather a lifestyle, or of ways of thinking. And we call ourselves a modern nation, but I think we're also a very feudal nation. And so there's always this kind of contradiction in our life between these two. And I guess the contrast of modernist forms to the material itself, which is coming from religious and other cultural, other economic sources, which actually, if you look at the people who make these things or who are engaged with these materials, their lives are hardly elevated by modernity itself. So I guess in that sense, there is a larger reading that you can have of the work.
And also when we look at your work, they are quite specific to a place because of the material link or the craft sort of traditions which are sort of translated into your practice. So what are other sort of opportunities for you to think about some locality beyond where you work and live?
Actually, I'm a little bit habituated. I like to be in one place to work. I can't function from hotel rooms, and I'm not a very nomadic artist, actually. But I do travel on work, but that doesn't necessarily encourage me to work in a new place. But there have been occasions when I have been working in elsewhere, like in Sharjah, for example, or in Hong Kong, where I produced a work. But that again meant 2 visits and looking at what was available there, how did it relate to my practice, was it something that I could, for example, you need to be politically sensitive to that country to be able to pick up something from there and make a making work. I mean, I wouldn't dare to do that. It's not done. So with Hong Kong, for example, I went into the streets and I looked at many things, but what I picked up was sequined fabric in their multitude, like it's all coming from China, and just the excess of the choice you had, for me, in a way, represented a certain consumerism that cut across many cultures at this point. So I used that sequin fabrics. Again, I chose abstract patterns, not something very representational in their design, and I made a work with stainless steel, which is totally out of my usual choices of materials, yeah. So it still sits a little bit uncomfortable with me, that work, but it's there. It's all bling.
That sounds really interesting. I'd love to see that. And perhaps it's the length of time, and I think it just shows how sensitive you are to the environment and how you select very carefully of your materials and other things. But you also mentioned earlier a little bit about the craft, and especially how you engage with this traditional craft materials and making of things. And can you think of a particular perhaps dying or disappearing craft tradition you'd be very interested in perhaps using more in your work?
See, contemporary art, unfortunately, is quite separate from traditional craft in India, and it shouldn't be that way, especially at the level of economics. So I'm very wary of taking the skills of craft people to make my work. The kind of skills I use are skills that are already made in the made products, so I'm not influencing them as telling them, you do this for me, use your skill to make this for me, because I believe craft traditions is about languages, and a lot of do-gooding people tend to think, okay, if I tell them to make me a candle stand instead of their basket which nobody uses, I will be helping them. But actually, it's very different from designers who have developed their own language to be able to get commission to do something because it's their language, it's something they have developed. But I think with craft people, it's a lot of the time, not always, a lot of the time, the skills are so linked to the language that they have inherited of that particular craft. So it really throws them off, Some of them are able to adapt to it, some are not. So in a way, I'm not sure our intervention in that sense is actually helping them. But let me just go to this work quickly to an image. These are finger-sized pieces of wood. So I just wanted to show this one because, as you say, that the couple there is the what is called Chandana Gombe, which is made of red sanders. I realized I was using illegal materials without realizing it, but this is already made. So I was not getting them cut the trees. But Chandana Gombe has a male and female character, which is very common. Apparently, it is used for exhibitions of dolls during Dasara times, and it is also something that represents a man, woman, and not a god, which gave me the freedom to use it as I liked. And again, it represented humanity in their bulk, like when you see them together. And what has happened from the time I began to be aware of this, in 2 years' time, a certain evolution has happened to that figure becoming this, and they're still figures, as you can see. They have rudimentary markings of eyes and nose and mouth. So what I'm trying to say is, I was interested in this. I didn't dare to touch that. They're beautiful objects, but I was more interested in the abstraction of this because of the as a piece, between something being a piece of wood to being a person. So that's what was the kind of my response to craft objects, actually.
Are there any other works you would like to say a bit more
I think
about?
I have shown more or less, no. Yeah, this is the one that you saw the exhibition of. Again, I don't know if the same form is used for construction here in Kolkata or in Delhi, but this is what's called a Bandoli in Bangalore, in Karnataka, and it's made from, again, drums, which have been flattened out. And these, unlike the tar drums, are colorful drums. And as you can see, each one has a maximum of 8 discs cut into them, and each disc is then becomes this bandoli. So, which again I reference modernism, with the materials, and as you can see the black square, which is a favorite motif of mine. And so this is how the bandoli is used on the head to carry construction. So in a way, it's referring to the construction industry and what we are doing to everything else. And this is all again a manual thing. That it is, these discs are cut by hand, not for me. They do it on a daily basis. I basically take what they do every day anyway. I'm not making them do something else. So huge amounts of this. And this was what made the invitation for the show, which for me is extremely meaningful. That I had the black square. I painted the black square on one of the discs, and then I made them make the bandoli. So there was a lot of abuse. I couldn't control. Once I had made it and given it to them, I had no control over it. So this particular moment is when the boy puts his, his working feet on the black square and produces this object for me. So in a way, there's the larger concerns.
Yeah, I think now we can maybe take some questions from the audience, if there are any.
Just a reflex remark. You call that abuse, depends on the culture you're coming from.
Which one?
The foot on the black square.
Uh-huh.
Others might not perceive it.
Not at all, but they understand other parts of the work, no? Not everything is accessible, as I said.
Where did you pick up the hairs? Are they from the temples, like those big rope kind of things? Not just strings. In the first work we saw, and they are tied with the car bumpers. So is that have any religious or ritual in it, that these strings or ropes from hair and they are tied with the car bumpers? Is it just your interpretation, or it came from your brain, or do people use these strings with the car bumpers for some ritual or religious purpose?
It is used in rituals. Actually, I think it's also used around fat cows and fat goats before they are slaughtered, so that people don't cast an evil eye as to how beautiful they are, how fat they are. Also, again with car bumpers. But then another thing I forgot to mention was that this hair industry is a huge worldwide industry. All the hair, the bigger, larger pieces of hair is auctioned worldwide. It's a huge money-making thing. So it's auctioned worldwide to make wigs.
Yeah.
So this again is a remnant. A lot of my work is remnants after the process has happened.
Okay, and can you buy them in the temples? Like
Sorry?
in Tirupati, a lot of people offer their hair. So are anybody allowed to buy them from the temples, or
No, I think everything is auctioned. It's at a higher level. I don't think you can go and pick it up. But then those things have already been done. I do not have to do that myself.
Okay, and what is the ritual between these, like the car bumpers are tied with the strings, the ropes of hair. What is the ritual for that?
There's no ritual. People buy it and tie it around their bikes or their cars. They feel good.
Okay, is it to avoid accidents? Or
Yeah. It's a talisman.
Like here, sometimes people hang
Black thread.
No. The lemon and the chili.
Yeah, it's the same thing. Same thing. But here it's human hair, so I was trying to figure out why.
Are there any further questions?
Just want to understand now in this new age and new time, everybody is constantly talking about recycling, upscaling. How do you really resonate with something like that?
How do I, sorry, I didn't
How
get.
do you resonate with this whole concept of recycling and upscaling, basically using waste to create a whole lot of art? So what is your thought on that whole concept, which is kind of something which everybody seems to be talking about all the time?
Actually, I don't select these objects or this material because I see myself as an artist who uses recycled material. It just is incidental that it happens that way because I see a meaning in that. So if other artists find the meanings in what they choose, beyond the fact that they say that it is recycled material, then I think it would be interesting.
Yes, the next one.
I mean, my question's probably a bit similar to Richa's. You mentioned modernization and modernity and how your work somehow intervenes or questions this assumptions of progress. And I was hoping you could, I guess, speak a bit more about that. Super interesting idea.
How do we, sorry, what was the question? It's very hard to hear. The acoustics are really bad. Could you?
Yeah, I was asking about modernization.
Yeah.
And your relation to your work to this idea of progress and how that reveals itself in India in particular.
I think I'm not talking about, yes, I'm talking about not modernization. That's something else in relation to the idea of modernity. What one would call the idea behind the push towards modernity. Basically, you are meant to be talking about that in a way that you are no longer in a way guided by feudal laws, that you're not guided by necessarily religion. That doesn't mean you're not religious, but that is not the criteria for your life somehow, to be where you are, to be what you are. And I think in India and many of the civilizations, it's not just, perhaps even in Europe, it's not necessarily completed. It's not really reached that sense of emancipation fully. And I think those positions of in between is something that interests me. That I'm not saying it should have been that, but it isn't. So it's a critique of this. I'm just saying this is how it is. This is perhaps there's a problem. There was a problem with what was where you wanted to reach, and perhaps then we can think of whether not reaching there is a good thing or not,
This is just a comment, really, which your practice brings out on several aspects of an art practice, whether it's abstraction or the use of the ready-made. And we were so conditioned about the ready-made as seen in Western practices. But I love what you're actually showing here, because there's complexity in the ready-mades that you use. There's labor already come into that ready-made, which you're picking up, and then producing this abstraction with it. And I think it's very reflective of the complexity of an Eastern society, which is going through this modernization as we see it. And it's just so many layers that you can read into what you're doing here, as opposed to a very kind of what happened with the use of ready-mades in the West was a very, I would say, didn't have so many layers. I mean, I'm not saying that it didn't have layers, but it didn't. So it's wonderful to see this kind of, where you have a whole industry that's flattening out the drums, that's in a sense is already producing an abstraction before you pick it up, and then you take it to another venue, another audience, another reception. And it's just fascinating and wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you both for that discussion. I wanted to actually ask you to perhaps reflect back. Sue mentioned that you started off as a painter, and of course, given that you studied in Shantiniketan and under Professor K.G. Subramaniam, and many of the ideas about craft, which are incredibly complex, I hear the way you describe it as a certain kind of language. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to maybe ask you to think about how your painting practice, where there was that kind of transition between that and working specifically with, for the lack of a better term, perhaps ready-mades, and using space in a very different way than the support of the canvas allowed you to do. And these are projects that perhaps are the last decade of your practice, but I'm interested also to ask you about slightly prior period to that, if you have certain works that you consider as a kind of very generative of that shift that happened.
I'll be quick about it. Yeah, the shift happened due to my own journey as an artist, somehow, because I felt there was a point at which I was painting, but I was not really, there's something that was missing. That feeling came about because of political happenings in 1992, 1991, where we, the artists whom I interacted with while I was in Mysore and Bangalore, we were really kind of felt inadequate as to how to talk about what was happening, because we were all feeling it here, but we didn't know how to address it, because somehow we had developed a certain language to paint with oil on canvas or use watercolor, and they become in a way inadequate for me to express myself. So it was in 1990 that I began to also think about it. It struck me, actually. It came like a vision. So when I encountered suddenly the possibility of using cow dung, and it's a highly potent subject now, anything to do with the cow, of course. So cow dung is a little bit safer. You can still see it as being an excreta. You can also see it as a... Sorry? I don't have it with me. I didn't bring it. I think we're running short of time, no?
Maybe we have maybe one more.
That'll take longer. No, I don't have the image. I don't have that image. Yeah, so cow dung became that vehicle for me to talk about, violence, which was predominantly what was disturbing us, the nature of the reason for the violence, that is religion. And on one hand it is shit, on the other hand it's sacred, so it kind of goes between these two, and it is traditional, and it is very versatile material. It's paper mache, it's pigment, it is, I've had it now for some 30, 40 years or whatever, and nothing touches it. It's perfect in condition. So fantastic materials, and it said everything for me. So just what I did with it then was something again to do with language, the abstraction of it.
I'm aware that we are a bit short on time, so if there is a really urgent question you really must share with the audience. If not, do ask us separately, perhaps. Just one more? Okay.
Because you mentioned initially that there is this abstraction which is a universal trait. So we mentioned universality as a trait. And you also seem to identify it with modernity. Now, I shall give two illustrations. One is, you see, the motif of Chandrashala is a window, arcuate window, which is to be there in the ancient architecture. It is to be a figurative motif, which is to provide a way for the god to look out. It was a lookout. And then in modern temples, it has been reduced to an abstraction, just a abstract motive without any meaning. So it has been voided of meaning through abstraction. Whereas in mother goddess figures, in all ancient cults, including the Cycladic, from which most of the modernists learned their, ideas. So that is a modernity of essentialism, which was characteristic of ancient art, primitive art, so-called primitive art. So what I'm trying to point out is that there are many ways to be modern than the Western. And basically, this concept of abstraction being universal has its moorings in the Western art. And the fact that the figurative and the non-figurative, distinction is a trait of modernity may be questionable.
No, I don't agree with you that abstraction is a Western thing. The way you read it might be different, but if you look at the linga, you look at you look at the primeval, the egg, for example. If you just see it as an egg, you don't see anything. You can't read anything into it, like you say. But it has lost its meaning. This form that you're talking about. But we have just lost the reading of it. That's all. We haven't lost meaning from it. And again, how did you know it had this meaning? Because you have studied it. But people who haven't studied it, for them, it's just a form. And what's wrong with just a form? At least you can always have layers. You can appreciate it as form. You can appreciate it with meaning. You can appreciate it as connecting many other things. So I don't think it's a loss, actually.
Kalyanji, on the same topic, I wanted to ask you that wasn't sacred geometry or yantras, tantric art, also to do with abstraction? No, I'm asking you because, I just wanted to, I was under the impression that you would be able to help me.
I'm only trying to point out that abstraction being an universal quality of modernity is questionable.
Yes.
Abstraction has been universal, to all times.
Yes.
And abstraction is visible even in prehistoric rock art. And that is a quality of essentialism. Reducing the shape to essentials, to essential geometry, essential,
well put.
Its outlines. That is also a modernity which is primitive, prehistoric. And whereas in this case of the temple, the loss of the meaning is emphatically clear. Because they do not understand the shape of the temple, the iconology of the temple, the philosophy of the temple. So if you ask them when they are making it, because the temple had all kinds of rituals associated with it, including chakshudana, opening the eye. So that is a ritual which has a meaning.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
So in the same way, you see the Joni Pitha. So I won't go into the detail. That would be improper. But all I'm trying to say in these cases, because these people have lost the meaning totally, so it is no longer essentialism. It is loss of meaning.
Yeah, but that is the case of what's happening in our country and many other places, that people who talk about culture, who talk about tradition, especially at the political level, don't understand at all what they're really talking about. So that is the unfortunate part. But definitely I'm not equating abstraction as being a Western thing. That's one part of it. But we have it in everything that we have in this country. It's just that we talk too much through meaning of words, but we're not looking at the form itself.
So leaving some food for thought. Thank you very much for sharing all this thought, especially Sheela. and the audience for sharing many interesting questions and answers. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Cyprian.